Welcome to part 10, where we're looking at the letter written to the Hebrews. This focuses on the word faith or faithfulness, and I've entitled it, The Life of Faith. The letter to the Hebrews centers and focuses everything on Jesus. Jesus presented as the great high priest who was also the perfect and complete sacrifice. And the aim, God's purpose, was to enable you and me to come to God and to have a relationship with Him, to be in His relational presence. That's why Jesus came. But when we are living the way of Jesus, the people then and we today recognize that it's counter-cultural, and society often doesn't like it. But in the midst of opposition, God will see us through. And so his encouragement to the hearers, to the readers, is don't give up. Don't give up. He speaks about confidence in the promises of God. God will see us through. He will not let us down. Jesus has opened the door of access to God our Heavenly Father. Jesus provides everything we need, and Jesus has offered us a destiny and a future which is most wonderful and marvelous. But the writer centers it in these two words, faith, which could be equally translated faithfulness, and endurance, when things are against us. Faithfulness is our ongoing response to God in obedience, not primarily intellectual. It's a word of action. Endurance is our determination to keep going, even when things are really against us. But the point he makes is our faith or our faithfulness underpins and leads to our endurance. But it raises the question which we left at the last presentation. How are we to understand this word faith or faithfulness? How is the word being used? What is its meaning? The last verse of chapter 10, but we do not belong to those who shrink back and are destroyed, but to those who have faith and are saved, or rescued is perhaps a better translation. If you do it in the original, just transliterating the words into English, but we are not of withdrawal to destruction, but of faith to possession of soul. You can see how the translation captures that quite nicely. But the word destruction carries the idea of total loss. We lose out on something. Possession carries the idea of obtaining or preserving something. So it's an opposite of loss. The soul, the word used there, is what makes you the person you are. Your personality, your nature, your mind, your emotions, your thought processes. The you that makes you, you. And that little word to suggests an idea of movement towards. We can move towards total loss, or we can move towards obtaining or preserving something wonderful. And he's encouraging us to go down the line of moving towards the obtaining or preserving, the real person that's us, that God made us, and allowing that to develop in the way God wants it to be. Great deep thoughts in that little verse. But the key is faith. It always is. Perhaps better translated, faithfulness. But which is it? And what does the Bible mean by it? Now let's stop for a minute and look at these words and the way the Bible uses them. Because they've come into English, particularly the word faith, and they carry with them often wrong kind of ideas today. The word in the original language is not primarily a word of cognitive belief. It is not intellectual. Believe A, B, C, sign here, you're in. That's not what it means. Nothing to do with that. And when we have our faith statements, we're in some ways deviating away from the principle and idea of what the word means in the original languages, both in Hebrew and Greek. Now in chapter 11, the author does offer a terse description of what's meant by faith or faithfulness. The same word could be translated either way. He then goes on to look at the lives of some great men and women of faith or faithfulness from the past, and the aim is to encourage us. It offers us a model. It gives us an example of perseverance and endurance, how their faith carried them through. But it also illustrates the meaningful lifestyle alternative, the way they went, which was different from the social norms of their day. And the way of Jesus always does that. But we're still skirting around the subject. Let's go to the text. Now, faith is the confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for. By faith, we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. We read it. We smile and hope we understand it. Now, faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. The danger with that is, it's often quoted, okay, there are variations in different Bible versions, and it's quoted as if it's a clear statement of the meaning of faith. But if we're honest, the meaning is often not completely clear. What's the author driving at? Remember, he was writing nearly 2,000 years ago in a different language, with different thought forms. What's he actually saying? What's he driving at? I mean, the English is straightforward. There's no ambiguity about that. But what does it really mean? Here's two alternative ways of translating it. Faith is the reality of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Here's another one. Faith is the pledge of things hoped for, the conviction of things we cannot see. Two modern interpretations of that same text. They do throw light in it, but what is the writer really driving at? In the original it says that faith is the reality of things being hoped, the evidence of things not being seen. So let's look at that and look at the words. Now that word there, reality, now you could translate it confident assurance that we will experience the reality we hope for. That captures the meaning. The word is drawn from the word of philosophy at that time, and it's only used a few times in the New Testament, mostly by the writer to the book of Hebrews. Confident assurance that we will experience a reality. And the word there is a kind of conviction. A conviction about a spiritual world promised by God. We can't see it physically with our eyes. Now that's a common word that has a range of meanings. And I've picked out the one that seems to capture the context and meaning here best. Where does that take us? Now there's a suggestion just to start our thinking going. Faith means we're living, it's practical, it's a doing word, and that captures the meaning of the original languages, is living in the reality of the spiritual realm. You can't see the spiritual realm, neither can I. But we're living in the reality of its existence. The reality of the existence of a God who made everything and who made us and who wants to relate to us, wants to help us through life and take us towards a great and wonderful destiny, living in the reality of the spiritual realm. that captures something of its meaning and starts our thinking going. Now, if you think about it then and think about it today, there are kind of two positions you see in society. Most of our societies in the West today are living for the here and now, the kind of physical reality of this world. And indeed, most of the decisions of our society and political decisions are based on that, with varying degrees of human logic, sometimes illogic. The other position is living in the in the light of an unseen spiritual reality, which is becoming increasingly real for us. We've not arrived yet. We've not got the whole picture yet. But I begin to realize that there's something that's hidden you can't see that underpins the whole existence of life and the nature of life, stemming from God the Creator. Now, why it's translated faith or faithfulness is very straightforward. The word faith speaks of a one-off expression of that living, where faithfulness is a kind of ongoing expression of this. You see, they're not different. You can have faith in a specific situation. You're living in the reality of this, living in the light of the unseen spiritual reality. Or it can be something that underpins your whole life in every circumstance of life, which is why faithfulness is often a better translation. Certainly, it makes a lot more sense of the Old Testament use of the word, which is what the writer to the Hebrews is drawing from. That's the kind of picture I quite like. We take God seriously and respond accordingly. We're living in the light of an unseen spiritual reality, which has become increasingly real for us. We take God seriously, respond accordingly. Now, perhaps this is allowing us to see something of what faith really means. I've broadened it slightly here. We live our lives. Faithfulness, an ongoing expression of it. Now let's go back to chapter 11 and let's see if it makes sense of this. We're living in the light of a reality of something we can't see, a spiritual reality. And our confidence, our assurance, what underpins our way of life is that. Look at the second part. In the original, that's what it says. By faith we understand the ages to have been adjusted by the word of God, so the thing being seen to have become not out of things as they appear. Now that's it, just literalistically, the words transliterated across into English. But it does help us. In the original language, that's the central point. That's the phrase that's emphasized. And it is emphasized throughout this whole chapter. By faith, occasionally through faith, by faith. By faithfulness. By the way we live in the reality of the spiritual dimension underpinning life. That's nothing primarily to do with the Bible. The word there is a word that's used of spoken. God speaks, things happen. God speaks, we can respond. That's the singular. You see, we look out and we see the whole of life, the whole way life goes. It's physical. The temptation is just to look at it at a physical level, nothing more. No, there's a deep spiritual level. And the spiritual level understands everything from the way the entire history of this universe comes into being. There's a whole spiritual dimension. And when we get that spiritual dimension, respond to it, we're living a life of faithfulness. That's reality, not just physical reality. And the question we have to ask is, what extent has God got a central place in our daily living? Not our intellectual thought. It includes that, but it's a lot more than that. It's daily living. spiritual reality? Are we living for the visible world of daily experience? Or are we living for the spiritual world, what God says and does? That's the way that's most common in our societies in the West today. That's what the writer to Hebrews is talking about. And when we live in the light of that spiritual reality, responding to it, obeying it dominating our thought forms and our actions, that's faithfulness. Faithfulness is a word of action, a word of doing. Back to our description, we live our lives in the context of an unseen spiritual reality which has become increasingly real for us. And it keeps on growing. He now takes us to examples to illustrate what he's driving at. Now, with that in mind, let's interpret these examples. It's going to be quite a gallop through them. By faith Abel brought God a better sacrifice than Cain did. By faith he was commended as righteous when God spoke well of his offerings. But by faith Abel still speaks, even though he's dead. By faith Enoch was taken from this life, so he did not experience death. He could not be found because God had taken him away. For before he was taken, he was commended as one who pleased God. And without faith it is impossible to please God. Without faithfulness it is impossible to please God. Because anyone who comes to him must believe he exists, and he rewards those who earnestly seek him. We're living in the light of the spiritual dimension. By faith Noah, when warned about things not yet seen, in holy fear built an ark to save or rescue his family. By his faith he condemned the world, showed them up, they wouldn't listen, and became heir of the righteousness that is in keeping with faith. If you look at Abel and Enoch, there are two extremes. Abel had his life cut short prematurely. Enoch moved seamlessly from this life to the next. Both were commended. You see, they both lived in the light of the spiritual dimension. They were living in the light of the spiritual reality that became real for them. They were responding to God. They took God seriously and acted accordingly. Noah, he saw the spiritual reality of the situation of his day, not just the physical situation. He responded by following God's directions. It's a word of action, faithfulness and faith. And the outcome was he and his household survived. You see how this illustrates living, taking God seriously, responding accordingly, seeing things from a spiritual perspective, not just the physical. Then there's that comment. And we kind of shake our heads and we say we've got to screw up more effort to generate some faith, because otherwise we can't please God. We somehow get that wrong. You see, we come back to the real meaning of the word. We live our lives in the context of an unseen spiritual reality, which has become increasingly real for us. The word is action. We're living our lives on a spiritual plane. We're looking beyond the physical. We're listening to God. We're seeking what He wants. We're then seeking to respond accordingly. If we rule the whole spiritual dimension out, which sadly so many in our modern societies are doing, we miss out on that. And we're living purely for the physical. And we will reap purely for the physical. But let's be cautious and careful here. Faith and faithfulness is a decision, or a series of decisions. It's not a kind of feeling. It's a decision. We decide. I will listen to God. I will act accordingly. It's not a rationality. Faith does not ask us to believe things that are contradicted by the evidence. And that's one of the sad things about religion, including Christian religion. At times we're being asked to believe things intellectually which cannot possibly be true. It's not a rationality. It goes away beyond our rational thinking, yes, but it doesn't contradict the evidence. God is always consistent. But faith is not something that you and I go into a corner and screw up all our efforts, say, I must have more faith, I must have more faith. That's not what it's all about. It's a decision. I decide I will live my life in the light of spiritual reality. I will seek to listen to God and act accordingly. That's faith, that's faithfulness. It's a decision. And that helps us to see how these ancient people worked things through. By faith, Abram, and he's a central figure in this chapter, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith, or faithfulness, he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. And by faith even Sarah, who was past childbearing age, was unable to bear children, because she considered him faithful who had made the promise. He'll keep his word. And so from this one man, and he as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as countless as the sand on the seashore. By faith Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had embraced the promises about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead, and so in a manner of speaking he did receive Isaac back from death. By faith Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau in regard to their future. By faith Joseph, when he was dying, blessed each of Joseph's sons. Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of Joseph's sons, and worshipped as he leaned on top of his staff. By faith Joseph, when his end was near, spoke about the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt, and gave instructions concerning the burial of his bones. The ancient patriarchs. Looking at Abraham, by faith, by faithfulness, Abraham saw things from a spiritual perspective. He took God seriously and acted accordingly. There were no maps in those days. There was no safe passage. He was going over a mountain range. He ended up in this land that God said he would give him. He didn't possess any of it. The only thing he ever possessed was one small field which he bought to bury his wife. When God tested him, he offered Isaac as a sacrifice, even though he knew the future lay through Isaac. He took God seriously and acted accordingly. He made many mistakes. He got some things wrong. But he lived in the light of the spiritual dimension. That characterizes Abram and his family, his sons, grandsons, great-grandsons. They never lost their confidence that God would keep his word. He brought them to this land. By the time of Joseph, they were now in Egypt. Egypt still grasped that the land would be theirs. That's faith, that's faithfulness. Living confident that God's promise for the future is sure. And his power in the present is real. That simple sentence is worth just writing out, pinning to your mantelpiece and looking at when life is tough. You could summarize it that way. They weren't looking at the physical, they were looking at the spiritual. That's faith, that's faithfulness. The little bit in the middle that we missed out was a kind of comment by the author. All these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. They didn't have the land. People who say such things show that they were looking for a country of their own. They kind of saw things at a spiritual level, something beyond it. If they'd been thinking of the country they had left, they would have an opportunity to return. Abram could have gone back. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly country, a spiritual realm. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he's prepared a city for them. The word city, that's the meaning of how it's used. Our picture of a city today is some great conurbation. That's not the way the word was used then. This is speaking metaphorically of their true spiritual destiny. Something away beyond what they could see physically. They all saw the spiritual dimension of what God was going to do. That's faith. That's faithfulness. And it's practical because it directs the way we live in the practical things of life. Let's continue on with the examples. Moses, another great person in the Old Testament. By faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born because they saw he was no ordinary child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. That's the Pharaoh. You see, the people of God had grown in number in Egypt. And as always happens, as God's people grow in number, fear, resistance, and persecution develop in the wider society. It's happening today. It's happening violently in China, North Korea, bits of the Islamic world. Persecution is growing. And the more persecution comes, the more God's people grow. That was what happened to the people of Israel, slaves in Egypt. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. She'd adopted him. He chose to be ill-treated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as a greater value than the treasures of Egypt. That's kind of looking back. Because he was looking ahead to his reward. He was looking at things from a spiritual level. By faith he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who was invisible. By faith he kept the Passover and the application of blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel. He listened to God and acted accordingly. Let's focus on that just for the moment. He was adopted into the royal family. Perhaps, we don't know. He was heading to be a pharaoh, we don't know. The good life of Egyptian royalty, and they had a good life. That becomes sin when it takes us away from what God wants. Now that's worth pondering in the practical things of life. There are many good things that get in the way of God things. So we could summarize it that way. And it's worth looking at that continuously and looking at our life and lifestyle in the light of that. We're living in the light of the spiritual dimension. We're listening to God, taking him seriously and acting accordingly. That's what Moses did. He could have had a very nice life, and he could have had a very positive influence on the royal court. Perhaps he would have been in a position to influence them to reduce the pressures of slavery on his own people. But he went that way. He went back to his own people. He looked at the spiritual nature of life. And he ended up rejected, vilified, and persecuted. And he ends up as a desert nomad, not possessing very much. He marries into a desert family, has sons. But God used that time to teach him the craft of survival in the desert. And that was critical. There were no maps in those days, but he knew the importance of oases. He knew how to move around. He knew the importance of water. He was able to lead the people through that barren desert in due time. By faith the people passed through the Red Sea as on dry land, but when the Egyptians tried to do so, they were drowned. By faith the walls of Jericho fell after the army had marched round them for 7 days. By faith the prostitute Rahab, because she welcomed the spies, was not killed with those who were disobedient. Now notice, by faith the walls of Jericho fell. How can walls have faith? No. Joshua and the people listened to God, responded accordingly, and carried out a crazy operation of walking round the walls blowing trumpets for 7 days. You see, that's where faith comes in, faithfulness. It's not something intellectual primarily. It's being willing to see the spiritual dimension of life, being prepared to listen to God and act accordingly. Now, the word prostitute there is just a passing aside. In the original Hebrew, it probably means innkeeper. Jericho was not a city as we understand a city. Again, we've got to watch the way words were used. It was a fortress. It was a fortress with maybe a few hundred soldiers at most, a couple of hundred. And it guarded the junction of 2 trade routes to keep them open. It also provided a kind of stopping off point where people could water their animals, catch up, get a decent meal before they moved on. And in that fortress there was an innkeeper, and presumably she and her family were providing for the travellers moving through. Prostitutes here because it's been taken from the Greek translation of the Hebrew, where the Greek translators have assumed that it's the word prostitute. It could mean either in the original Hebrew. If we see it as an innkeeper, it makes a lot more sense. Rahab saw the significance of what was happening in the spiritual realm. Being an innkeeper, she would be right up to date with the news because of travellers moving around. So she welcomed the spies. All of these situations, the people listened to God. They took God seriously with what he said, and then they acted accordingly. That's faith, that's faithfulness. And that's the description of faith or faithfulness that I find most helpful, because it's so short. We take God seriously and respond accordingly. It's a lifestyle decision. And the writer here has taken numerous examples of great men and women who did that precisely. And he's shown, using the established and known history that will be known to his hearers, he has shown the outcomes. They would know it. And what faith and faithfulness can do, and the benefits it can bring. In the longer description, faith and faithfulness is an action word. It's living our lives. Not primarily intellectual. We live our lives in the context of an unseen spiritual reality. That reality is kind of broken through in us, and it's become increasingly real for us, and it goes on becoming increasingly more real if we allow it to go on with us. It's a decision, and it's a decision that leads to action. That is living by faith. And that's the driving force of what the author is showing here. When we live that way, it enables us to persevere, to get through, to cope with life, whatever life may throw at us, whatever persecution may throw at us. We take God seriously, respond accordingly, and He takes us through to something greater and better. That's living by faith. Now in the next part we're going to bring that together and tie it into suffering and our spiritual development.